Hey y'all, it's Miss Sheila here, and today for our video notes this week, you are going to learn about quotations, quotation marks, and when and how to use them. In case you're not sure what quotation marks are, I've put the title quotations in quotation marks. So we're talking about the double quotation marks here, and there are going to be 4 general rules that we're going to talk about when you should use quotation marks. So the most obvious time that you have to use quotation marks is in dialogue. So that's the first rule that we're going to talk about here today is when to use, or excuse, not when, but how to use quotation marks in dialogue. So if you're writing down something that someone has said word for word, you need to use quotation marks. The quotation marks should start when the person starts speaking and end when they are done speaking. Punctuation marks such as commas or periods will go inside the quotation mark. If you had a question about that, always go inside the quotation mark when you're using dialogue or punctuating dialogue. You also need to provide attribution with your quote. So that means you tell your reader who said it. So this could go 2 ways. If you're writing a story, like a fictional story, you need to let your readers know who's saying what so they don't get confused. If you are writing, like, say, a news story and you're reporting something that someone said, you definitely want to attribute who said it with first and last name. Whereas with a fictional story, you could be a little less formal and just use the character's first name. You also want to start all direct quotes with a capital letter, even if it's in the middle of a sentence. And I'll show you some examples in just a second where you can see this, but always start your dialogue with a capital letter. And then if you're doing dialogue with 2 speakers, say in a fictional story, you're going to want to start a new line with each new speaker. So that's important to remember, specifically if you're writing fiction. So here's some examples of how to punctuate direct quotes with attribution. There's 3 examples here. The first one starts with the attribution coming first. Her teacher said, comma, notice the comma here, setting off the attribution from the quote, and then you start the quotes. The trouble with Gabby is she's very talkative in class. And then there's a period at the end, right here, and then you put the quotation marks outside of the period. If you are putting the attribution at the end of the sentence, you start the quote, quotation marks, capital letter. The trouble with Gabby is she's very talkative in class. Then you're going to use a comma because the sentence isn't over, just what you've said is done. So you put a comma here, quotation marks on the outside of the comma, and then you say her teacher said, period. Now say you're putting the attribution in the middle. The trouble with Gabby, comma, what I'm saying or what's being said by the teacher is put in quotation marks, still a capital letter. Because it's not the end of the sentence, we put a comma and then end quotation marks. And then we say, her teacher said, comma, and then start the new quotations, is she's very talkative in class, period, quotation marks. Now the is does not need to be capitalized here because it's the middle of the dialogue sentence, and when we start the dialogue, the start of the sentence will be capitalized, but when you're breaking it up in the middle, you don't then need to capitalize that second start, if that makes sense. So when it's broken in the middle, you don't need to capitalize this because think of the dialogue piece as one sentence. So where that sentence starts, you want to have the capital letter, but if you split it in the middle, you don't need to then capitalize where you pick it back up. Okay, second rule. Using quotation marks when citing directly from the text. You hear your language arts teachers and your social studies teachers say a lot of times to use evidence from the text. And a lot of times what we want you to do is cite things directly from the text that will prove your claim. You're going to do this a lot when you're writing with an APE paragraph, answer, prove, explain. Your proof might be direct quotes coming from what you've read. You might see this and use this in your DBQs in social studies, or if you're writing an argument essay, or even just answering a seminar reflection question, or anytime you're being asked to prove what you're saying or the claim that you're making, you can use direct quotes from the text. That's called textual evidence, and it helps to prove your claim, and it's a good piece of textual evidence. You also need to use quotation marks when you're pulling something word for word from the text. So when to use quotation marks with when citing textual evidence. So use it when you're quoting something word for word from the text. If you're just paraphrasing, you still need to cite where you're getting that information from, but you don't use quotation marks. You're only using quotation marks if you pull it word for word. All of the information from the text should go within the quotation marks. And make sure, a lot of times you'll start your quotation marks, but then you forget to end your quotation marks, so make sure you start and end them. You want to attribute where your information is coming from. In most cases, you'll include the author's last name and page number from the source, and that information can go in parentheses. It might lead to your sentence, sort of how we did with the dialogue, where you start at the beginning, like according to this text, blah, 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 put in your direct quote. But you definitely want to attribute that information so that your reader knows where you got that information from. If you're using parentheses, where you're putting the author's last name and the page number sort of at the end of your direct quote, the punctuation will go outside of the parenthetical citation, and you'll see an example of that. You do not need to start a new line if you're using another direct quote from a different text. So it's a little different from dialogue. Remember, we said in dialogue you start a new line with each new speaker. When you're using textual evidence or evidence directly from the text, if you're pulling from a couple of different sources, as long as the ideas go together, you can keep them in the same paragraph. So it's a little bit different from dialogue in that way. So here's some examples. This is a parenthetical citation right here, where we've got the author's last name and the page number. So that's what I'm talking about when I say parenthetical citations. So we lead in, according to some, dreams express, and then this is the part that comes directly from the text, profound aspects of personality. So what is pulled word for word directly from the text is put into quotes. The rest is not in quotes because it's not coming from a source. It's the author's own thoughts. Notice the comma to kind of set off the direct quote goes outside of the parenthetical citation. Here's another way to cite the same thing. According to Folk's study, dreams may express, and then we put in direct quotes what's coming directly from the text, profound aspects of personality. Okay, then we put the page number where it comes from in parentheses and a period outside of the parenthetical citation. If you wanted to put both the author's last name and the page number in parenthetical citations, you can, just like up here. This one's asking a question. So at the end of the parenthetical citation, we're going to put a question mark, just like we would if we were normally asking a question. It doesn't make it any different that we're using a direct quote and parenthetical citation. So just so you're not confused there. All right, and this is just another example where we've already put the author's name in the sentence, like preceding the direct quote, so then at the end we just cite the page number. So essentially when you're pulling directly from a text, you need to cite the author's last name and the page where you got it from. Using quotation marks to bring attention to certain words. This is our third rule of when to use quotation marks. So for example, if a word is used out of context or in an unusual way, such as to include a slang word in formal writing, or when it's a word that might be being used sarcastically, you want to put it in quotes. So here's an example of a word being used sarcastically. It was a happy occasion if you like being humiliated in public. No one likes being humiliated in public, so obviously the occasion wasn't happy. This writer is using sarcasm, so the word is put in quotes to let the reader know that it's sarcasm. And then here's an example of slang being used in formal writing. Language arts is lit. Obviously it's lit, but that is slang. Lit is slang, so it's being put in quotation marks. Okay, and then finally, using quotation marks for titles. We always get confused about when to use quotation marks for book titles or poems, or when do we use quotation marks. So here is some rules for when to use quotation marks. You're going to use them for short artistic works. So not the whole book, but if you're citing just a chapter in the book. Not the whole TV show, but a specific episode, okay? A poem, you would put in quotes. A song, not the entire album, but one song from the album would be put in quotes. A podcast would be put in quotes. Titles of individual courses of study, but not areas of study. So for example, a class I took in college was History Post 1940. So that is a specific course, so it would be put in quotes. But if I were just saying I'm taking a history class, I wouldn't put that in quotes. You're going to put short stories in quotes. You're going to, you're going to put articles in magazines articles from magazines. You'll put those in quotes. But if you were citing the entire magazine, you would italicize it. So articles within the magazine get put in quotes. And then any literary piece that is not bound as a book. General rule of thumb, if it's not in a book or a larger anthology, it's most likely, if it's not a book or a larger anthology, it's going to be put in quotes. So here's some examples for you. Shawn Mendes' song Mercy is his best yet. And sorry, I forgot to finish that one. Robinson's sonnet, Richard Cory, is one of the best to ever come out of America. So this is one sonnet. A sonnet is a poem. So this is saying it's the best. His third chapter is strangely titled The Sink in the Sky. Poe's best story, I think, is The Gold Bug. And The Gold Bug is a short story, so it's being put in quotes. It's not a long novel. So those are some examples of when you would use quotations for titles. If you have any questions about any of the information we've just gone over, please feel free to watch the video again. And you have some practice to do and some notes to fill out. And good luck.